Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today I've got answering student questions. Actually, just one question this time. This is an excerpt of what became a 5.5-hour video that I made for my students this summer. Right? They asked in a discussion forum a series of 25 questions, 25 students, 25 questions, and I decided I would do a video response to them. In my class, when I'm doing face-to-face, they ask anonymous questions, and I have to stand in front of the class and give somewhere between a 2 and a 5-minute response. Now, I'm not limited to the 5 minutes since I was on video, and obviously I wasn't limited because I went for hours and hours and hours. Some students got an entire lecture in response. So I've taken a couple of those questions, and I've made small videos out of those. And then eventually I'll publish the entire video. But I just want to remind you, as you listen to my responses, these are mostly on the fly. I mean, I didn't do a lot of preparation to answer these questions. I simply looked at it and said, here's how I would respond to that. Here's some thoughts of mine. And those thoughts also are in the context of this is a class that has a broad spectrum of students in it from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different opinions about mostly the topic of evolutionary biology. And so my responses have that in mind. Some of my responses are a little different than maybe the tact I would take if I were sitting down with you over a cup of coffee and talking about these subjects, or if I was talking to a specific critic or something like that. So just bear that in mind in terms of the style of response that I'm going to provide for some of these questions. I'm also in a sort of a teaching mode because I'm trying to use my responses to help them understand some principles. So I'm breaking down some of their questions into fundamental assumptions and trying to derive sort of like things that I know that they're going to need to know, through the rest of the class, and trying to sort of squeeze those elements into my answers to their questions. Okay, so with that caveat, or those caveats, let's proceed to answering a student question. Coming on up. In your opinion, is it a fair question to ask which species is the most evolved? Why or why not? And if it's a fair question, which species do you think is the most evolved? I asked the question because it's a question I received in my animal physiology class, and I had a difficult time attempting to answer this question as it is complex. This is a good place to start. It really isn't a fair question within the context of evolutionary biology, or with the context of what we're going to learn in this class, right? Each species has its own unique history. Each species is adapted to a specific environment and has its own set of characteristics that make it best suited for that particular environment, right? For survival in its own particular ecological niche. So you'd have to be asking yourself, what makes something the best species, right? If I were to say, what's the most evolved species? Well, then you're really asking what species is the best fit for its particular environment. Or if you only had one environment, which is the species that's best fit for it? The thing is, if you only had one environment, one niche, one set of environmental parameters, there probably would only be one species that best adapts to that particular environment to the exclusion of all other species. And so I guess you could say in that situation, you had the most evolved species, but you'd only be saying you had the most evolved, most adapted set of organisms or individuals of the species for that particular environmental condition under those particular specific environmental traits or conditions. As soon as you move to another set of environmental conditions, that same organism that was very well adapted, or you could say evolved for that particular environment, is no longer the best for another environment. There's going to be another organism that is best fit for that other environment. So you might be thinking, many people are thinking evolution is sort of this ladder-like thing where organisms are progressively climbing to somehow higher states all the time. And so the idea of the most evolved actually goes back to an idea that we talked about. So remember in class, when we're talking about sort of the evolution of thought, the history of thought, we talked about the great chain of being. And we talked about sort of that being different higher states of being. And that's then co-opted in some early ideas of early but not modern evolutionary biology ideas of that somehow organisms are progressing to different stages, right? And that they're stepping up constantly. They're constantly seeking to become better in that way, right? As though there's some sort of linear change of progressive climbing to some sort of higher states. See, evolution, which is just an ongoing process driven by genetic variation, natural selection, and the other mechanisms that we talked about in class, it's not striving, right, to an end point. It's not striving to some predetermined goal. And the whole idea of this question is, what is the most evolved? Almost does kind of smack of the sense of there is a sense in which organisms are trying to become the best, all right? They have this predetermined, they have this goal, they have this thing out in front of them. And whoever gets to that point is the most evolved. So rather than talk about most evolved, it'd be more accurate, all right, more scientifically sound to describe species in terms of their unique adaptations and evolutionary histories, rather than to try to sort of rank them on a scale of being more or less evolved. Each species has its own set of characteristics, as I just said, and that's going to allow them to survive in particular niches. Hey, I can think of an organism that is really well evolved for living in water, right? It has a lot of specialized traits for being able to capture oxygen, right, from the water. But you take that organism out of the water and place it on land, and it's very poorly evolved for that particular state, that particular place. And human beings have amazing features for survival in this world, but there are many places that you and I can go for which there are other organisms that are better adapted than we are. Are we going to say, should we say that they're more evolved than we are? I guess in a relative sense, they're better adapted for that particular location than we are for that particular environmental condition. So every organism, I kind of think of it as every organism that's alive on the earth today, all right, is really well adapted to some specific set of environmental conditions. And they are the most evolved, all right? They're the best adapted organism for that particular environment at this point in time. Otherwise, there'd be a different organism there at this particular moment in time.